So we're currently flying at flight level 380, which is lower than we normally fly, but we're trying to stay out of turbulence, which is at a higher altitude. So one of the main reasons I decided to start making flat earth debunking videos was the amount of nonsense I was seeing on their channels relating to aircraft, the way they follow the curve, how the flight paths are plotted on the Earth, and in particular, emergency landings. One of the most famous incidents that flat earthers try to use is China Airlines Flight 8 that departed from Taipei in Taiwan, heading towards Los Angeles, California. During that flight, a woman gave birth to a child and the aircraft diverted correctly to Anchorage, Alaska, which was the most suitable option in that particular scenario. What we're going to look at briefly in this video is this flight, the mistakes flat earthers make, how it can be plotted correctly. I'm going to talk about some further considerations that pilots need to think about in these emergencies. And then I'm going to hand over to my friend Ruhiv, who has done an excellent video debunking a number of other flat earth claims on this topic. So this emergency diversion has been explained many times years ago by myself and other people. In fact, back in September 2016, I produced this image, which is the flight from Taiwan across to Los Angeles plotted correctly on a globe using a great circle track. And you can see that an aircraft following this path is going closer to Anchorage, Alaska than it is to Hawaii. If there was an emergency halfway through the flight with the aircraft approximately here, it would be much faster to divert to Anchorage than it would to go to Hawaii. Another consideration, with the woman just having given birth, you need to go to a place that has a hospital. There's no point diverting to a small remote airfield where there are no medical facilities. I'll talk about that a little more shortly. So I think we can all agree that with the aircraft following this magenta route, Anchorage, Alaska was closer than diverting to Hawaii. Now, what usually happens on these flat earth channels is they plot the route incorrectly on the globe and then claim it doesn't make sense. Well, clearly, if you don't plot it accurately, it won't make sense. This channel, Flat Earth Banjo USA, Japan and Brazil, has a number of videos on this topic. Now, Eddie is pretty harmless, but he really doesn't have a clue what he is talking about. He doesn't understand flight paths, and I have asked him directly if he knows how to flight plan, and he admitted to me that he does not. Here you can see he has drawn the flight from Taipei to Los Angeles completely incorrectly on the globe. Let's now listen to Eddie describing this scenario.
On Thursday, after Taiwanese passengers' water broke 6 hours into their 19-hour journey. So, if she departed, that's why I have here, let's go. She departed Taiwan, okay, Taiwan right here. And she was flying to Los Angeles, okay, it's the blue line, okay, she was flying to Los Angeles. 6 hours into the flight, let's say 1/3 of the journey, the water broke. Okay, so I'm dividing this distance in 3. Okay, it's 19 hours flight, 6 hours into the flight, they had to land. So the easiest way for her could have been actually Hawaii, right here in the middle. Okay, Hawaii. She could have flown to Japan. She could have, not she, the pilot could have flown back to Taiwan.
So he makes a number of basic mistakes, and the first one being the flight path drawn incorrectly over Hawaii. Looking at this line, it makes no sense why they would divert to Anchorage, Alaska, but this line is not what the aircraft actually flew. It flew a path closer to the Great Circle route, and as you can see, this line goes closer to Anchorage than it does to Hawaii. The other mistake he makes is assuming that this flight had a duration of 19 hours. With a diversion occurring 6 hours into the flight, he claims that was 1/3 along the route. That is incorrect. Looking at FlightAware, the sector from Taipei to Los Angeles is around 12.5 to 13 hours duration. So 6 hours into the flight is just before halfway, approximately here. Anchorage is a no-brainer. So Eddie incorrectly claims that this sector from Taiwan to Los Angeles was 19 hours. I know where the 19-hour figure came from. This trip originates in Bali, Indonesia. It then flies up to Taipei, lands, refuels, picks up additional passengers, and continues on to Los Angeles. So this actual sector is 12.5 to 13 hours. I have addressed this emergency previously, years ago, back in April 2017, in a video titled Flat Earthers Don't Understand Aircraft Emergency Landings. In this case, a different flat earther had drawn the path directly from Bali to Los Angeles. Again, it is a case of drawing the path incorrectly and then claiming the diversion to Anchorage makes no sense. This flight actually went up to Taipei and then across to Los Angeles. So drawing it directly from Bali is just further evidence that these flat earthers do not research the topic properly. What I find quite incredible is that flat earthers are still making these basic mistakes. There's really no excuse, as we have addressed this particular emergency a number of times on my channel and on several other channels. But here, on the 13th of July 2020, a channel by the name of Don't Sphere the Truth again plots the route incorrectly straight from Bali up to Los Angeles, claiming it was 19 hours and 13 minutes. He then chose the flight path going from Bali direct to Anchorage with a claimed time of 23 hours and 45 minutes. Now that figure is just ridiculous. I plotted the track from Bali to Anchorage on Google Earth and obtained a distance of 6,000 nautical miles. Now in my aircraft, doing 470 knots average speed, I can do that in around 13 hours. 23 hours and 45 minutes is ridiculous. This is no more than a 15-hour flight tops. But as we saw, it is pointless because the flight did not go from Bali. It was from Taipei to Los Angeles. Just more inaccurate information by flat earthers. One thing I found quite amusing is that despite the many rookie mistakes in the video, Globebusters have mirrored it. It really speaks volumes and shows me that they are desperate for content these days. Bob claimed to be a commercial pilot. We know that wasn't true, but even as a private pilot who hasn't flown for 40 years, the mistakes in this video are glaringly obvious. They're clearly not even trying to appear genuine these days. So before playing Ruhif's excellent video, I'm just going to touch on a number of points that flat earthers never seem to consider when analysing these emergencies. But as pilots, we clearly do. Does the emergency require me to land now or at the nearest suitable airport? A land now emergency would be a crippled aircraft. If it is a medical emergency, it might make more sense to fly the additional hour to an airfield near a hospital. Point number 2, PCN versus ACN, pavement classification number versus aircraft classification number. There's no point landing on a runway that is not strong enough to support the weight of the aircraft. Point number 3, medical facilities. If I have a sick passenger, I would not land at a remote island airstrip where they cannot get medical treatment. I would fly an additional hour or two, if necessary, to a major airport. Maintenance facilities. Again, if it is not a land now emergency, it will be more economical to fly to an airfield that has decent maintenance facilities. 5 and 6, the weather at alternates and the instrument approach types. There's no point diverting to an airfield where you can't land due to unsuitable weather. Point number 7 and 8, alternate transport for passengers or accommodation for passengers. Certainly a consideration if you're flying a 747 with 300 people on board. Point number 9, is the runway long enough to depart? In a land now emergency, That may not be a great consideration, but in virtually all other types of emergencies, you don't want to land at an airfield that is so short that you'll never get the aeroplane off the ground again. And point number 10, is there a requirement to dump fuel? That can take a considerable amount of time, so that time can be used to fly to a more suitable airfield. So without any further ado, I'll play Ruhif's video in full. He gave me permission to use it on my channel, but better still, why not click on the link in the description below and watch it on his channel. If you like his work, please consider giving him your subscription. Ruhif is one of my favourite Flat Earth debunkers, and he won the Search and Rescue Flight Planning Challenge. He is not a pilot, and yet he was able to produce an extremely accurate flight plan. And this is why I don't accept the excuse from flat earthers when I ask them if they can flight plan. The most common excuse I get is, I'm not a pilot. Well, neither is Ruhif, but he can flight plan. So what's your real excuse?
All right, let's look at some more emergency landings. Now, this is the video that I'm responding to. It's called 6 More Emergency Landings Prove Earth Not a Globe. If you look at the URL, you might think we're looking at the Phuket Words alternate channel, but we are not. We are looking at this guy, which is Eddie Alencar, also known as Flat Earth Banjo, Brazil, USA, Japan or something. This particular video, he has disabled comments, and of course he has. How else will you remain a flat earther when you will never know that you're wrong? It's also 77 minutes long for six flight analyses, which is a bit excessive. Banjo's also written a book, and you can buy it in hardcover on lulu.com for 60 Australian dollars, or about $43 US. All right, so here are the 6 flights. Number 1, China Airlines from Taiwan to LA, emergency landing in San Francisco. Banjo thought that it should have kept going to LA. Number 2, Lufthansa from Bogota, Colombia to Frankfurt, emergency landing in Manchester in the United Kingdom. Banjo said that it should have landed in Lisbon, Portugal, Madrid in Spain, or Paris in France. Number 3, Korean Airlines from Paris to Seoul via Anchorage, crash landed in Russia. Yeah, where it should have landed. This is a pretty crazy flight, and Banjo's explanation is even crazier. Number 4, Air France from Paris to Shanghai, emergency landing in Irkutsk in Russia. Banjo doesn't really say where it should have landed, just that Irkutsk is a very long way away. Number 5, American Airlines from Dallas to Beijing, emergency landing in Calgary, Canada. I imagine Banjo thinks that this should have landed in the Pacific Ocean somewhere, or nowhere. We'll check that out in a minute anyway. Number 6, Korean Airlines from Chicago to Seoul, emergency landing in Anadyr, Russia. And again, he does not mention where it should have landed, only that Anadyr is a long way from the route. All right, let's look at number 1. China Airlines flight 006 from Taipei to Los Angeles should have continued on to Los Angeles rather than making an emergency stop in San Francisco. The big problem that Banjo makes is using Google Maps to show him the flight path on a globe. This particular route shown on the screen here is not a Great Circle route. Google Maps is not trying to tell you what the route is here, it's trying to sell you tickets. See the sponsored link over here. To work out or to show the actual Great Circle route on Google Maps, you need to use the measure distance tool. So right click on Taipei, go down to measure distance, and then left click on Los Angeles, and that will show you a Great Circle route, which would be equivalent to the flight route or the flight path. So if you zoom in here, you will see that San Francisco is actually quite close to the Great Circle route, and that the route given by the flight selling software is way off. All right, so let's listen to Banjo's analysis of this flight. He seems to think it's coming from the west and would be quite a diversion to get to San Francisco. So let's have a listen.
It doesn't really make sense on the globe.
It will only make sense when we compare on the flat Earth map. Okay, it would have to take more time for them to get San Francisco and more fuel, which means that on the globe, comparing this flight on the globe doesn't really make sense, right? This is the exactly screenshot that we got from the report.
No, it's not. It literally says down the bottom, this is from the Smithsonian Channel. And secondly, this up here where you're pointing is not San Francisco. This is Oregon. If you want to know where San Francisco is, it's around about here. And even the front page of the NTSB report makes it clear. It's 300 nautical miles northwest of San Francisco, California. First page. The flight was uneventful until just west of reporting point Redu, about 300 nautical miles northwest of San Francisco. And you can actually look up where this waypoint is. Here it is here. So the flight was just west of Redu. So obviously, the most obvious emergency landing airport is SFO San Francisco, rather than heading on to LAX. All right, number 2, Lufthansa 543 from Bogota, Colombia to Frankfurt. And here is a link if you'd like to read more about it. Just a little excerpt here. The time of the berth at 12:37 was normal. The place of berth rather not. The altitude above the North Atlantic was 39,000 feet at a latitude of 49 degrees north and a longitude of 21 degrees west. To place the mother and her child into medical care as soon as possible, the captain decided to make a stopover in Manchester in the United Kingdom, where they landed at 13:09 local time, now with 192 passengers on board. Right, so here is the yellow line here is the Great Circle route from Bogota to Frankfurt. Banjo thought that the flight should land in Lisbon, Portugal or Madrid in Spain if it were on a globe. Obviously that's a very long way away from the Great Circle route. Charles de Gaulle in Paris was a good option, as was London Heathrow, but they decided to go to Manchester, which I thought was quite odd. Also odd was the location of the baby's berth at 49 degrees north, 21 degrees west, which was also quite a way from the Great Circle route. So I actually hit up Lufthansa News on Twitter and asked them why it landed there, and they gave me some very useful information. Probably the most important part was that London Heathrow and Charles de Gaulle airports are quite busy. So first of all, getting clearance to land and getting emergency care is time consuming. So going to a less busy airport like Manchester was actually quite a good option at the time. What I also did was plot the last 7 days worth of this particular flight on Google Earth, just trying to figure out why that location of the baby's berth was so far off the Great Circle route. And here they are plotted on Google Earth. You'll see the blue line here is the flat Earth route, so the AE map projection route. And the yellow line here is the Great Circle route, and the pink and black lines are the actual routes over the last week. So you can see they're pretty much all over the place. They favor the globe very slightly, I guess. You'll also see the location or the coordinates of the baby's berth just there, which is basically in the middle of the two routes. And you'll even see that route there go straight over Manchester. So those routes are quite variable, and you can't really draw a conclusion one way or the other.
This flight, I believe it's one of the best of the 6 to show how the truth of our Earth can be represented on the flat Earth map.
I completely agree, Banjo. This is your best one, and it's at best ambiguous. My best is the Sydney to San Diego flight taking 12.5 hours, yet on a flat Earth, Sydney to Los Angeles, which is roughly halfway, takes an hour longer. Explain that one, champ. All right, number 3, and this is a crazy flight. Korean Airlines 902 from Paris to Seoul in South Korea via Anchorage. So starting down here, flying to Anchorage, refueling, and then heading to Seoul, South Korea. This was in April 1978, so well before GPS was allowed for civilian use. It was also during the Cold War, so I guess that's why they didn't fly the direct route from Paris to Seoul through the Soviet Union. The flight path they did take took it almost directly over the magnetic North Pole, which was roughly here at the time. And that kind of explains why this flight was as crazy as it was. The explanation given is that the flight navigation systems went haywire as it got close to the magnetic North Pole. So about 5 hours into the flight, they checked into a radio station or radio base on Ellesmere Island in Canada. That was 5 hours and 21 minutes into the flight. For some reason, shortly after that, they did a big right-hand turn and started heading towards the border of Finland and Russia. It entered Soviet airspace approximately 8 hours into the flight, where it was intercepted by Russian fighter jets. There are some rumors that it was actually shot at, and it was forced to crash land somewhere here. Anyway, go and have a read of the wiki page. It's pretty incredible. First of all, let's check out where this flight actually went. So here is the Great Circle route that I have mapped onto Google Earth. Here is actually a diagram of where the magnetic North Pole has shifted over the last century or so. So you can see at 1978, when this flight was around, that's where the magnetic North Pole was, which is roughly here. So this flight did go quite close to the magnetic North Pole, and because this was pre-GPS, their navigation systems did rely somewhat on compasses. Alright, so let's have a quick read of the New York Times article that came out just the day after. It's called "Flight of South Korean Airliner Very Puzzling to US Officials." And I want you to take note of the radio contacts that were made. So this paragraph, it made routine contact with checkpoints around England and Scotland. It reported that the weather over Greenland was clear. And here's this radio contact on Ellesmere Island. The report was made 5 hours and 21 minutes after takeoff on a 9-hour flight. And then a rough guess is that the plane crossed the Soviet coast 3 hours after the turn. And there's the link if you'd like to have a read. All right, let's listen to Banjo's assessment, or his theory. Here we go.
So this is my position. I defend the idea that this pilot was actually just flying straight from Paris to Seoul. And at the moment he crossed into the Soviet Union, he was shot at and had to make this emergency landing.
Quite frankly, that's a freaking ridiculous theory, Banjo. I mean, to accept your theory, you really need to deny all the evidence. And if that's not a great metaphor for flat Earth in general, then I really don't know what is. All right, number 4, Air France 116 Paris to Shanghai, which landed in Irkutsk. This is again another example of Banjo using Google Maps flight paths when he should either use the measure distance tool or he should use Google Earth. So this flight landed in Irkutsk, which is here. Obviously very close to the actual Great Circle route rather than the route given by Google Maps. Number 5, American Airlines 263 from Dallas to Beijing landed in Calgary. So this is the flight path given by Google Maps, which is crap. The actual flight path, either using the measure distance tool or Google Earth, goes quite close to Calgary, which is where it landed. Number 6, Korean Airlines 38 from Chicago, way off the screen to the right, over to Seoul, way off the screen to the left. Again, here's the comparison between the flight routes given by Google Maps and by the measure distance tool or Google Earth. And it landed in Anadyr, Russia, which again is quite close to the Great Circle route. All right, so the big takeaway of this video: Banjo, don't use Google Maps for flight paths.